Richard Pryor was a legend who left us in 2005 with a comedy legacy worth $40 million. But beyond the jokes and the headlines, he also left behind 7 kids from 6 different women. These kids grew up with a dad who was equal parts hilarious and troubled. Pryor married 7 times, yep, 7, and dealt with drug addiction, run-ins with the law, and even a near-fatal incident setting himself on fire. So, being his child, not your average upbringing. Some of the Pryor kids followed in his showbiz footsteps, while others chose totally different paths. Some faced addiction and scandal, others sought out normalcy and privacy. In this conversational storytelling deep dive, we'll go kid by kid, sharing their upbringing, their relationship with Richard, their careers, their personal dramas, and where they are now. Number 7. Renee Pryor. Renee Pryor is Richard's oldest child, born when he was just 16 years old. Imagine, Richard Pryor was basically still a kid himself in 1957, navigating teen parenthood while growing up in his grandma's brothel in Peoria, Illinois. Renee's mother was Pryor's girlfriend at the time, a woman named Susan, and little Renee came into a world of chaos before Pryor's career even began. With her dad so young and not yet a famous comedian, Renee was largely raised outside the glare of Hollywood. In fact, Richard didn't really become a big star until the late 60s and 70s, so Renee's early years were probably pretty ordinary, or at least as ordinary as being Richard Pryor's daughter could be. Growing up, Renee saw her father sporadically. Richard's personal life was a roller coaster, multiple marriages, and constant touring, which meant he wasn't always around for his kids. After his first burst of fame, he tried to be more present. There's a revealing story from the late 1970s. After one chaotic marriage ended, Pryor told People magazine that he was focusing on his children. At that time, Renee, around 20, was actually living with him in Los Angeles. He even took all his kids on a summer trip to Europe, but joked, "I'm not going to make that mistake again." There was just not enough daddy to go around. That quip shows both his humor and the reality that juggling 7 kids was overwhelming. So whatever happened to Renee? Truth is, Renee Pryor has mostly stayed out of the spotlight. Aside from that, one People mention and occasional family photos, little is publicly known about her life. We do know she did not pursue showbiz or the public eye. She's now in her mid-60s and, by all accounts, living a private, quiet life. Number 6. Richard Pryor, Jr. Born in 1962 to Richard's first wife, Patricia Price, Richard Jr. grew up mostly with his mom in Peoria, Illinois, while Dad was off becoming a superstar. He was about 6 years old when he first realized his father wasn't like other dads. He was famous. Can you imagine? One day you're a kindergartner. The next you're like, why is everyone laughing at Daddy's jokes on TV? Richard Jr. later said he had a wonderful relationship with his father, despite the distance. As a kid, he'd spend summers and holidays out in California with Dad, where Richard Sr. would spoil him with a cook and housekeeper and all the perks of Pryor's celebrity life. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Richard Jr. was also exposed to his father's dark side. For example, he was devastated when his dad nearly died in a 1980 freebasing accident, learning at a young age how dangerous his father's lifestyle could be. As a teen and young adult, Richard Jr. struggled to find his own identity while living in such a gigantic shadow. He loved performing, even doing drag shows in the 1980s, as part of exploring his artistic side. When the tabloids got wind that Richard Pryor's son was performing in drag, Pryor Sr. surprised everyone with his reaction. Instead of anger, Richard told his son, "Whatever you do, be the best at it." Yes, the king of edgy comedy basically gave his blessing for his son to do his own thing. This was huge for Richard Jr., who also eventually came out as gay and had worried about how his dad would take it. That supportive attitude from Pryor shows a softer side as a dad. He may have been outrageous on stage, but with his son, he was accepting in his own laid-back way. However, like his father, Richard Jr. fell into substance abuse. By the late 80s, he was addicted to cocaine and alcohol, at one point freebasing and shooting up regularly. He later admitted, "I was so far gone doing cocaine every day and Valium on top of it." Things hit a low during the filming of the movie Critical Condition, 1987, where Richard Jr. had a small role alongside his dad. He was hiding stashes of drugs on different floors of the set. That's how bad it got. Finally, one night, he broke down and called his father for help. "I called him up with a needle in my arm. I didn't know what I was doing," he later revealed. Richard Sr. stayed calm, perhaps too calm, which oddly made Richard Jr. angry at the time. He was hoping Dad would scream and set him straight, not realizing Richard Sr. might have been high himself at that moment. But Pryor Sr. did spring into action. He and his bodyguard flew Richard Jr. to Los Angeles and checked him into rehab. It wasn't easy. Richard Jr.'s heart actually stopped at one point from an overdose of sedatives during detox, and doctors had to revive him. Thankfully, he survived. "It's a blessing I'm still here," he said later, and began the long road to recovery. Fast forward to today, and Richard Pryor Jr. has turned his life around. He got clean, embraced his truth, and even wrote a memoir in 2019 called In a Pryor Life, where he tells all about growing up with a famous dad, coming out and overcoming addiction. In interviews, he's candid about both the good and the bad of being Richard Pryor's son, from the laughter and lessons to the wounds he had to heal. Richard Jr. still performs in small shows. The entertainment bug never left and is determined to keep his father's legacy alive. A few years ago, he and his sister, Rain, even acted in a film that paid homage to their dad's work. More on that later. Number 5, Elizabeth Pryor, born in 1967, is Richard's third child and perhaps the most scholarly of the bunch. Her mom was Pryor's girlfriend at the time, Maxine Anderson. Elizabeth grew up in Los Angeles during her dad's comic superstardom, but unlike the Hollywood scene around her, she gravitated toward academia. If Richard Sr. used explosive humor to talk about race and society, Elizabeth took a more analytical route. She became a historian and professor, using education to make sense of some of the same issues her dad joked about. Today, Dr. Elizabeth Storter Pryor is an associate professor at Smith College, where she focuses on 19th-century African-American history and racial discourse. She's even given a memorable TED Talk on the history of the N-word in America. A bold choice, considering her father famously used that word in his routines, and later swore off it. In that talk, Elizabeth dives into why that word is so difficult and divisive, bringing a thoughtful scholarly lens to a subject her dad once approached through comedy. Critics noted the poignancy of Richard Pryor's daughter deconstructing a slur that her father had reclaimed on stage. It's like she's closing a circle. Richard used the word to expose racism's absurdity, and Elizabeth is examining its history to educate a new generation. Talk about honoring the family legacy in your own unique way. Growing up, Pryor wasn't easy for Elizabeth either. She was only about 10 when her parents split, and she saw her dad irregularly. In fact, back in 1977, little Elizabeth, then age 10, was one of the kids Pryor tried to connect with during that ill-fated European vacation with all his children. She and her half-sister Rain were the young ones on that trip, and Pryor admitted it was overwhelming. As an adult, Elizabeth mostly kept out of the tabloids and built a distinguished career. But she did make headlines in the mid-2000s, when family drama erupted over her father's declining health and estate. After Richard's MS diagnosis and during his final years, Elizabeth, along with some siblings, grew concerned about his treatment. When Pryor died in 2005, It was revealed that he had left control of his estate to his last wife, Jennifer Lee Pryor, and not to his kids. Elizabeth, Richard Jr., and Rain banded together to challenge this. They even accused Jennifer of elder abuse, suggesting she unduly influenced Richard's decisions late in life. It was a nasty legal battle, and ultimately, Elizabeth lost the court fight to remove her stepmother as trustee. That had to hurt, but it showed how fiercely Elizabeth cared about her father's legacy and well-being. These days, Elizabeth Pryor keeps a relatively low public profile. Instead, she's respected in academic circles and continues to lecture and teach about race, language, and history. It seems she found her calling in education far from the stand-up stage. Yet, in her own way, she's continuing Richard Pryor's tradition of challenging Americans to talk about uncomfortable truths. Number 4. Rain Pryor. Rain was born in 1969 to Richard's second wife, Shelley Bonus. Fun fact, Rain's mom is Jewish, a go-go dancer turned astronomer, and her dad, of course, was black. So Rain grew up proudly black and Jewish. She often jokes about how that unique mix shaped her identity. In fact, she created an award-winning solo show called Fried Chicken and Lot Keys that riffs on her mixed heritage and the race relations of the late 60s off the early 70s when she was born. With a background like that, Rain was basically destined for a life in storytelling. Rain's childhood had its ups and downs. Her parents split when she was only 6 months old, so Rain was raised mostly by her mother and maternal grandparents in Beverly Hills. She said she had what was essentially a normal life, despite who her dad was, and that was by design. Rain's mom kept her grounded far away from the Hollywood craziness. And Richard wasn't a daily presence, though he loved her. Rain has recalled that her father wasn't always there for school plays or birthdays, but when he was around, it was magical. She has vivid memories of her dad being this magnificent man who could light up a room for his kids, but also times he let them down due to his addictions or distractions. That emotional push-pull defined Rain's early years. Still, she adored him, and even as a young girl she understood that millions of people also adored her dad. As a teenager, Rain broke into acting. She graduated Beverly Hills High in 1987 and soon snagged a breakout role on the ABC sitcom Head of the Class. She played the spunky T.J. Jones, a character the producers basically created just for her after she wowed them at the audition. Talk about charisma. In the 90s, Rain continued acting, notably as a series regular on the Showtime Dramedy Root Awakening. She's guested on tons of TV shows, Chicago Hope, The Division, etc., and appeared on late-night talk shows, charming hosts like Johnny Carson and Craig Ferguson with her wit. Beyond acting, Rain is a comedian and singer, performing jazz cabarets and stand-up that often weave in stories about her famous dad. She even wrote a memoir titled Jokes My Father Never Taught Me, a funny and moving account of growing up black and Jewish with Richard Pryor as your father. I mean, that could be a stand-up set in itself. In her adult years, Rain made a conscious decision to step out of Hollywood's fast lane. She moved to Baltimore, Maryland in the late 2000s, seeking a more down-to-earth life. And boy, did she dive into the community there. Rain became the artistic director of Baltimore's Strand Theater in 2012, mentoring local talent. She fell in love with the city and its people. By 2019, Rain decided to give back through public service. She ran for Baltimore City Council 3rd District in 2020. Yes, Richard Pryor's daughter went into politics. Rain campaigned on community issues. She wasn't just trading on her name. She ultimately lost the Democratic primary, but her run showed how passionate she is about making a difference beyond showbiz. And who knows, she might try again. She's that determined. Rain has also been a vocal MS advocate. Remember, her dad battled multiple sclerosis, from the mid-1980s until his death. Rain witnessed firsthand how devastating that disease was. So she became an MS ambassador, hosting and speaking at events worldwide to educate people about treatment and to push for a cure. It's a cause close to her heart, continuing her father's crusade for better treatments and awareness. In interviews, Rain often reflects on Richard's legacy with love and complexity. She defends him fiercely, more on that in a bit, but also acknowledges his flaws. She's happily married since 2018 and has a young daughter, whom she's raising with the same mix of laughter and groundedness that she got from her own upbringing. Today, Rain Pryor is in her mid-50s and truly a hometown hero in Baltimore, a far cry from the glitzy LA kid she once was. She still acts occasionally and performs one-woman shows. Her talent for storytelling is chef's kiss, but her priority is being a mom, wife, activist, and community leader. Number 3. Stephen Pryor. Now we come to Stephen Michael Pryor, sometimes spelled Stephen, born in 1984. Stephen is Richard's second youngest son and the first of 2 kids Pryor had with his 5th wife, Flynn Belaine. By the time Stephen was born, Richard was in his mid-40s and a seasoned superstar, with plenty of life drama already behind him. You'd think being the baby boy of a comedy icon might automatically put you in the limelight, but Stephen's story took a different turn. In contrast to his famous dad and some of his siblings, Stephen Pryor has kept a very low profile. In fact, little is known about Stephen publicly. Stephen's early years must have been unconventional. Richard and Flynn's marriage was on again, off again. They married in 1986, divorced in 87, then remarried in 1990, and split for good in 91. So Stephen witnessed a lot of domestic ups and downs as a toddler. He also had an interesting situation with siblings. Stephen's half-brother Franklin was born just a few years later in 1987 to another woman. So Stephen and Franklin are very close in age, and Stephen's little sister Kelsey, Flynn's second child, was born in late 1987, meaning Stephen was a middle child and a big brother by age 3. Richard Pryor's household in the 80s was complicated to say the least. We don't see Stephen popping up in media interviews or trying stand-up like some of the others. He seems to have chosen a private life away from entertainment. Number 2. Franklin Mason Pryor. Born in April 1987, Richard Pryor's youngest son, child number 6, and perhaps the one who most explicitly tried to follow in Dad's comedic footsteps. If you haven't heard of Franklin, it might be because he usually goes by his stage name, Mason Pryor. He's the son of Richard and Geraldine Mason. Note how his stage name honors Mom's maiden name and Dad's last name. Mason was born during a particularly tumultuous time. Richard was battling MS and splitting with Flynn, while Mason's mom was a girlfriend on the side. Drama, drama, drama. Classic Pryor. As a result, Mason didn't grow up with his father in the house. Richard's health and marriages were in flux, so Mason was predominantly raised by his mother, Geraldine. But being Richard's son, the comedy DNA was strong in this one. In his 20s, Mason decided to try stand-up comedy, which is both brave and daunting. I mean, your dad is literally Richard Pryor, often hailed as the greatest stand-up of all time. That's a lot of pressure, and audiences inevitably make comparisons. Mason started performing at smaller venues, honing his craft. By the late 2010s, he got a shot at the big stage. And that's when one of his pivotal and painful moments happened. In 2018, Mason Pryor appeared on the revival of Showtime at the Apollo. The crowd was hyped and very curious to see if Richard Pryor's son had the goods. At first, it seemed promising. Mason walked out, visibly nervous, and joked, "I can literally hear my dad up in heaven right now. Like, boy, you better not mess this up." The audience laughed at that, a great icebreaker acknowledging the elephant in the room or theater. But, unfortunately, what came next didn't land. Mason launched into a Trump-Putin joke that fell flat, and within seconds, the famously tough Apollo crowd started booing. You could see the panic in Mason's eyes. He even pled, "Boo, have some respect," which only made it worse. The boos got louder and poor Mason froze. In true Apollo fashion, they gave him the hook to get off stage after he stalled too long. It was a rough outing. Basically, every comedian's nightmare, magnified by the legacy he carried. But here's where things get interesting. Instead of crawling away in shame forever, Mason showed resilience and humility. Backstage, he admitted on camera, "I bombed. I wasn't funny." Pretty gutsy to own it like that. Even Apollo host Steve Harvey felt for him. He later invited Mason back on stage that same night to tell one quick joke as redemption. Mason managed to squeeze out a funny bit about his parents' breakup, turning personal family drama into humor, very Pryor-esque, which the audience chuckled at. Other comedians rallied around him after the episode, telling Mason that bombing is a rite of passage and encouraging him to keep at it. Mason himself kept a sense of humor. "I went from being, 'Yo, you're that one comedian's son,' to 'Yo, this dude is not funny, but he's here,'" he joked, poking fun at his own flop. Since then, Mason Pryor hasn't given up. He's continued doing stand-up gigs, determined to grow into his own persona. He acknowledges that being Richard Pryor's kid opens doors, but also sets the bar sky high. And while his Apollo moment went viral, for all the wrong reasons, it taught him something invaluable. You've got to earn the audience's laughs on your own merit. Mason is now in his mid-30s, still grinding in the comedy scene. He's had some solid sets. You can find clips of him getting laughs at clubs, showing improved timing and confidence. Number 1, Kelsey Pryor. Born in October 1987 to actress Flynn Belaine, Richard's fifth wife. Kelsey was literally the baby of the Pryor bunch, arriving just 6 months after her half-brother Franklin, Mason. Yes, you read that timeline right. Richard had 2 babies by 2 women in the same year. If that doesn't sum up the chaotic Pryor love life, nothing will. Kelsey's birth came at a tumultuous time. Her parents, Richard and Flynn, were already separated. They divorced a few months before Kelsey was born, so Kelsey entered the world with her parents living apart and her dad's health in decline due to MS. She likely has few memories of Richard from childhood beyond visits, as he was wheelchair-bound by the early 90s and not in her daily life. So, what do we know about Kelsey today? Honestly, very little is publicly known, and that's by design. Kelsey Pryor has kept her life deliberately private. Unlike her older sister Rain or brother Richard Jr., she hasn't written books or done interviews about being a Pryor. From what we gather, Kelsey grew up largely outside Hollywood, possibly in Illinois or wherever her mom settled post-divorce. She avoided the public eye entirely while her dad was alive and continued to do so after his death in 2005.